Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us to a second session of the Communist Culture Club. We're very pleased to have a range of speakers tonight. We're going to talk about Dune, we're going to talk about George Orwell, we're going to talk about the cultural Intifada, but we're going to start with something we've just added today, which is a discussion on Al Jazeera's new documentary, October 7. Tony Greenstein, I've talked to him earlier about it because he can't be with us tonight. Unfortunately, it is in a different meeting, but I've interviewed him about this film, and I would recommend everybody watch it. It is quite harrowing in parts, but it's certainly useful for various reasons that we're going to discuss now. So I'm going to share the screen now. Here we go. Thanks for joining us, Tony. Tony Greenstein is here with us to talk about Al Jazeera's new documentary, October 7. The investigative unit of the channel has featured evidence from the cameras of Hamas fighters and some Israeli soldiers, as well as interviews, piecing together really a timeline of October 7, what happened when. But Tony, tens of thousands of Gazans have already been slaughtered by the Israeli army, and many more will die because of starvation and disease. Why do you think is it important to look back at exactly what happened on October the 7th?
Well, it's important to look back for this reason, that October the 7th is the pretext for the genocide and the ethnic cleansing. And so I think we need to dismantle the Zionist narrative that this was a second Holocaust, that this was the greatest slaughter of Jews since the Second World War. And furthermore, it was an uncontrolled rape frenzy orchestrated by Hamas with the aim of hurting and destroying and killing as many Jews as possible. In other words, it was nothing to do with the occupation. It was nothing to do with the suffocating siege. It was about the innate anti-Semitism and burning hatred for Jews as Jews by those who were living in the Gaza concentration camp. And that has been the Zionist narrative throughout. And they found it difficult at times, certainly at the beginning, to get their story together, because you remember 40 beheaded babies, a baked baby, apparently babies being hung on clotheslines. It was all of that. It was.
Visiting celebrities continue to be shown babies' cribs, and the world continues to be told stories about murdered babies.
When you're taking babies, cutting them and tying them together and burning them to death, you're treating them less than an animal.
1,300 people dead, murdered, babies.
These bastards put these babies in an oven and put on the oven. We found the kid a few hours later.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken describes the fate of two small children.
Family of four, a young boy and girl, 6 and 8 years old, and their parents around the breakfast table. The father, his eye gouged out in front of his kids. The mother's breast cut off. The girl's foot amputated. The boy's fingers cut off before they were executed. And then their executioners sat down and had a meal. That's what this society is dealing with.
This story also comes from Yossi Landau and Zaka. An analysis of the evidence suggests that it is also untrue. Of the 782 unarmed victims of October 7, 36 are children, 13 under the age of 12. None died in the circumstances described by Antony Blinken.
There were two babies who died, and one of them was just killed by a stray bullet.
I mean, the documentary, I thought it was quite good because it is trying to stay with the facts, you know, and it is saying Hamas did commit crimes, and there are some pretty gruesome scenes actually about the music festival. You remember when there's a group of young people in a bomb shelter, and you can see it, you know, and Hamas goes in and basically executes them. But the tenor of the documentary is, you know, Hamas did commit crimes, but not many of the crimes that the Israeli government and the media are pretending it committed. For example, the 40 babies, but also it looks at the claim that there was mass, widespread and systematic rape, and that is taken apart as well. What were for you the sort of standout moments from that documentary?
Yeah, I mean, I think the documentary showed a glimpse of what happened on that day, and it sequenced it so that we understand how it progressed. That has not been done before in any systematic fashion, and that was very useful. But as you say, I mean, Hamas aren't nursery school teachers.
No.
I mean, this was not a children's picnic. It was an exercise where people who went did not expect to come back.
Mm.
And of course, if you like, their liberation in being in their occupiers' territory for the first time, yes, atrocities were committed. I'm sure, you name me a slave revolt where atrocities weren't committed. There were far more bloody affairs. In Haiti, the slave revolt, it killed every single French white person, man, woman, and child. I mean, one could not have defended that, but would one defend the right of the slaves to revolt and to free themselves? Yes. So, I mean, Hamas in many ways behaved impeccably compared to, and it was a story in the Times of Israel. It was on, I think, the 9th of October. I put it on my blog, where a Hamas fighter goes into a kibbutz home. The father lunges at him with an axe, I think, and he's killed. The mother then attacks and she's killed. And there are two children there with their, I don't know whether their mother, I think it was. And then Hamas writer writes on the wall, Hamas does not kill children, and then puts a blanket around them. So, I mean, this idea that they deliberately went to kill the children and so on, I mean, it's totally untrue. And in fact, the statistics prove it. There were two babies.
I mean, children were obviously killed and young people were killed, so
very few.
They're not saints. But was interesting, as you pointed out, most of the Hamas fighters did not expect to live after this. They expected to die within a few minutes, hours. That whole aspect of the Israeli army not being prepared. I mean, this is an interesting one and it's being discussed widely as well. The documentary claims or shows, Israel had warnings, plenty of warnings. The Hamas fighters put their videos up with the paraglide, training with the paragliders, etc. But they were they seemed totally unprepared. Some have speculated they let it happen on purpose. The documentary does not. Where do you still stand on that?
I mean, it was described, or has been described, as the greatest intelligence failure since the Second World War. It was a massive intelligence failure. And why? Because of the hubris of the Israelis and also their racial arrogance. They did not believe that Hamas was capable of it, coupled with the fact that they trusted that their billion-dollar fence with its automatic machine guns, sensors, and so on would defeat anything. And yet, very low-tech drones and paragliders and bulldozers did the job. I mean, there were all sorts of lessons to be learned from that. But no, I don't think it was that they were let in. It's inconceivable. It's much like 9/11, really. I mean, these conspiracy theories, but the political consequences, if it was ever found out that they deliberately let them in, would be too great. Certainly, I don't think there's any chance. Yes, they were given warnings. That was the case in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War. No, I don't buy into a conspiracy theory of that nature.
So were there any other moments that you thought would make this documentary really useful to watch?
I just think that the sequencing of it, to see, for instance, that Hamas came first, then the other militias came second, and then the freelancers, and who may well have raped the odd individual woman. Rape and war, unfortunately, go together. No one's pretending it didn't happen at all. But what is absolutely clear is that this was not an intended rape or orgy, if you like. The purpose of Hamas and the other militias was clear: to capture as many people, to take them back as hostages. They clearly didn't think that this might be the pretext for ethnic cleansing of the whole of Gaza. and that is a political mistake that they made, without a doubt. But we can see that they wanted hostages, and of course they captured them in a not too nice or gentle a fashion, but you would expect that.
I mean, the documentary also shows that there is almost like a wild firing at people by the Israeli army once it's got going, and there's, you know,
well, that's the other thing. I mean,
yeah, military experts saying, you know, they've shot their own hostages quite clearly.
Well,
I mean, it's not in overwhelming numbers, it has to be said, but there was clearly, you know, a lot of confusion.
well, we don't know. We don't know what the numbers are. What we do know is that about midday, the Hannibal Directive was put into operation. And this is a kind of, you know, this is a kind of Nazi doctrine that it's better to kill your own people than let them be taken captive, because then they can be exchanged for prisoners. I mean it's an unbelievable thing which puts no value by the Israeli state, even on its own Jewish citizens when it comes to it. That instead of doing everything possible to rescue them, they say it's better to kill them. Why? Because they don't want to let Palestinian prisoners out free, and that, in essence, is what it's about, and that's what the invasion of Gaza is now. They're more interested in killing Palestinians than saving their own captives, and that tells you really everything about the morality of the Israeli state. And on the day, the helicopters strafed concert goers. There was more that wasn't shown. There were cars piled up on a highway by the festival, and they seem to have been just a turkey shoot. We don't know how many cars were hit, but there were very considerable numbers. I mean, whether it's half or a third or a quarter, the fact is that of the 700 odd Israeli civilians, a large number were killed by their own people, including nearly all of those at Kibbutz Be'eri, which was 121, I think.
Well, the documentary doesn't actually make that claim. They only point out a few 20-something unexplained reasons. So they are treading very carefully to not be sued, I guess, or whatever. But there's probably more, you think, yeah.
Well, Kibbutz Be'eri lost 120, I know that. And tank shells were fired into every single house. And obviously, if you fire a tank shell into a house, you kill the people in it, and that's what happened. And the damage that was done, you know, we saw early on, you know, people kind of frozen, black, charred bodies in cars, and this was attributed to Hamas. But we know now they didn't have the weaponry to do that. That was Hellfire missiles from the helicopters, the Apaches that were circling above. So, I mean, a considerable number were killed by the Israelis on the day, including actually quite a lot of soldiers. They bombed their own bases. They bombed the Erez Junction, for example. So we will never know. We will never know. And the Israeli army doesn't want to investigate that part of it for obvious reasons.
That became clear as well. There's the UN wants to send a unit in to investigate the claims of mass and systematic rape, and they've still not be allowed in. And it's quite powerful to hear them say that, you know, we've tried and we've tried again and we're not allowed in. So that shows really.
Well, they've destroyed all the forensic evidence. They just buried the bodies. They didn't take any until they let these religious messianic nuts from what's the group, I can't remember now, Zaka, that's right.
Zaka, yeah.
Who have no training whatsoever, are on the far right, and who just lied. I mean, you saw that guy who just lied and lied again. He swore he saw all these beheaded babies and so on, and they weren't even there. They didn't have.
He says he's showing a picture on his mobile phone to the journalist, isn't it? Because he doesn't want to show it on camera. And the journalist goes, well, where's that baby? You know, oh, it's over there. Can't you see it? No, I can't see. So it's not bullshit, isn't it? He's exposed himself quite beautifully in that film.
And then he says anyone who questions what he says should be killed. So.
Thanks very much, Tony. It's a very worthwhile documentary to watch. Everybody should.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that was. It is a really good documentary, and I do urge comrades to watch it. It is very much worthwhile. Before we discuss that, though, we propose that we go to our second item first, which is a discussion with Tamdeen Byrne, actor, Scottish actor, about parts of how we can actually fight back and how we can stand up and show solidarity with the Palestinians, which is about the cultural intifada. Tam, hi.
Yeah, hi, Tina. Hi, everybody. Just to say, first, on top of what's just been seen, the other place to get a lot of information on what actually happened on October 7th and refutals of the lies that have been perpetrated by, well, the New York Times and so many that does get touched on in the film there, Al Jazeera, is the electronic intifada. They are a real touchstone for me of trying to make sense of what's going on, finding out the actual information. There is a wealth of proof that that October the 7th was, especially on things like this Hannibal directive. I mean, where have any of the mainstream media even mentioned this term at all? And this is, a massive part of the problem, is that Al Jazeera and electronic intifada are there's only very few news agencies given anything like the truth at all, and not completely bound up in feeding the lies. But it's clearly not convincing people. People can see through it more and more now, and there is such a massive level of activity going on, and in the cultural sphere, that's what interests me most. As you said, I'm an actor, and I came across another actor. He came to Glasgow in 2007. He's only a month older than me, and his name was Giuliano Mercamus, and he had made a film of his mother's work, Arna Meir. She was a member of the Communist Party of Israel, and so was his dad. And then she had previously even been quite a overt Zionist activist, but when she was asked to attack Bedouin tribes, she rebelled and completely flipped over and turned into a class traitor as such, and then did a lot of work in Jenin refugee camp, especially with the first Intifada, and helping children there because their education system had collapsed, and she started up working there, and Giuliano went, and he'd been a very successful Israeli actor, and that he went there and started filming what his mum was doing, and this eventually became a documentary. She died in 95, and Giuliano then went back to working in theatre in Israel for 7 years, but then he finished off this film, this documentary, that came out in 2004, called Arna's Children. And it's an absolutely wonderful documentary. It's on YouTube. I'll put the link up. ARNA, Arna's Children. It won many awards for it as a documentary, and it showed how theatre had been helping these children, but then the Israelis went in and destroyed it. I mean, their theatre at that time, they called it the Stone Theatre, and that was in honour of all of the children that were throwing stones at at the Israeli forces, because it was a theatre of rebellion. It was considering itself as cultural intifada. And he then, with Zakaria Zubeidi, who has been quite famous in more recent times for being one of the 6 prisoners that escaped using the spoon just a couple of years ago. And one of the most extraordinary before October the 7th abilities of to be able to break the Israeli security, and he escaped and he was on the run, but he has been captured again since. But with Giuliano, Zakaria Zubeidi set up what they called the Freedom Theatre, and in Jenin refugee camp. And it was an extraordinary theatre that gained worldwide significance. I mean, and this is a children's youth theatre. And it shows how culture can make such a difference. You know, a tiny little place there became known throughout the world. And to the extent that Giuliano was assassinated, still never been really fully investigated of what happened to him, but he was shot through the head in his car with his 2-year-old son sitting on his lap. So, you know, they've gone about atrocities, and, you know, this has been going on. It's for decades and decades. And the Freedom Theatre has carried on since. They've been under a lot of attack. Their producer, Mustafa Shetty, is still in prison now under this administrative detention. That means that they can hold you without charge for as long as they like. And several other members of the Freedom Theatre, a children's theatre, have been banged up in similar fashion and tortured, and they destroyed the theatre. But there is still that groundswell of recognition that it's important, and it is a means of fighting back, and also a means of dealing with the whole post-traumatic stress that young people have been put through over the years, and never more so than now. So this cultural intifada, which, you know, I wanted to give the talk primarily because another guy who has become a hero to me, but sadly only since he died, Rifat Al-Aria, a lecturer at the Islamic University in Gaza, again, him assassinated in November. An extraordinary guy, and such a loss, and again targeted specifically because of the work that he was doing culturally with young people. I wanted to then look at this whole question, and in order to explore his work and other work within that's been happening in Palestine closer, which I've only partly been able to do, but I've got the ball rolling on that score. But his lectures that he gave to his students in English, because he believed that students should learn English so that they could use that as a weapon to speak to the world, and Shakespeare being a weapon that they could use. He put a lot of store by that, of learning and understanding Shakespeare, and his students really took that up, and that to me just extraordinary as well. There is students in Gaza who 2010, 2014, they produced these Gaza monologues, writing about what they were going through. And there was a performance of these that was called for on the, what day was that? I think October the 29th. Yeah, or November the 29th, you lose track with these months. It's just been perpetual onslaught. But it fundamentally was on the day of the UN Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. And there was a call to perform these monologues around the world. And this was done in so many countries across the world. There was a lot done here in Scotland. We in Glasgow and Edinburgh, we performed these monologues by these young Gazan youth, and they had such resonance, even though they had been written 10 years before. They were the augured what has been going on in the last 5 months, and there's been new ones getting written. And I've done one of them for an album that's come out that is been a fundraiser for Gaza, and it was called From Shakespeare to Gaza, a call for William Shakespeare 400 years on to come to their aid. Quite extraordinary, I find. But also this cultural intifada that has been launched this week by the Freedom Theatre and artists on the front line. It's there as an extraordinary website already of materials that can be used and techniques that can be used and material that can be used. There you go. It's the proof that this global artistic movement is happening right now. I've seen so much evidence of it here in Britain, in Scotland and Britain, and it's being it's like more, you know, in the few months, sort of in the middle of last year, I started committing much more to doing cultural work on climate, the climate emergency, and I found with that, and now with this struggle, it's in the main young women that are leading the way on these issues, and on these cultural fronts. And I find that extraordinarily inspiring, especially, you know, being an old white male commie, you tend to find that that's the sort of company you find yourself in often. And I mean, even the people that's speaking tonight is, you know, similar in a way. But it's young women that are leading the way on this in all sorts of extraordinary ways. And that's what really heartens me, that this is a struggle that is now worldwide, that is rooted in the fight for Palestinian rights and freedom, but it's also tied in with the climate, those connections. I'm seeing it. The climate groups in Glasgow are connecting, you know, parents for Fridays, which, you know, there is climate groups going on. They recognize these are the same struggles, and this is what, to me, above all, is most important, that taking our inspiration from Palestine and on the climate, that these, our enemies, are clearly the very same, and they have exposed themselves completely. All they have to offer is war and genocide, and that is capitalism. That is the where our enemy really lies, and people are recognizing that more and more. And I can see that culture is going to be playing more and more of a part in that. And so I'm glad that this has happened now. Communist Culture Club is what's needed, and to be exploring these issues. So I'll leave it there just now. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Comrade. That was really inspiring. It's fantastic. I mean, that young Gazans or people in Gaza can use culture as a way to express themselves or fight back, but also that we can use it here as a way to show solidarity and to collectivize, isn't it? It's also, we need to collectivize and build our own organizations, our own forces to have some kind of power to stop the slaughter and stop our governments from doing what they're doing. And there are very few avenues, especially with the right to strike, right to protest being under such threat at the moment. So thank you very much, Tam. If anybody would like to discuss or say anything on the first two items, raise your hand. Don't just do that. Click the button, raise hand, and I can bring you in. There's lots of issues to discuss. I think, Dan, did you want to say something? Because you had some differences perhaps with Tony. If you want to speak, just click raise hand and I can bring you in.
Sure. Can you hear me now, or
yes, we can hear you.
Great. Tony and I have had numerous disagreements. Tony is, he's really energetic. He's really a fighter. But I think that some of the things he says simply just are not factual. The film was very careful. It spoke about 27. It discussed 27 unexplained deaths, and there may have been a few more in this kibbutz called Be'eri, which came under attack, one of the major assaults that took place. And where Tony says the majority of the deaths were caused by the Israelis, that I've just have no idea where that comes from. It just doesn't make any sense to me. It just doesn't add up. We know that Tony is right and the film is right, that this was a fantastic, this is one of the most amazing intelligence failures we have ever seen in modern military history. And as a consequence, the Israeli response was very delayed. It was very confused. It was very haphazard. And there were undoubtedly friendly fire incidents where Israelis helicopters fired on cars heading back to Gaza, not really knowing who was in those cars. And it's quite reasonable to believe that 2 or 3 dozen people were killed in those circumstances. But I'd point out that 27 is merely about 2 or 3% of the total. So something really, really bad happened on October 7th. And I think there's no shrinking from that fact, and attempts to sort of massage those facts and wish that away just are not counterproductive. I think the first task of Marxists is to stare reality in the face, to look at it with all its complexity, all its brutality, all its horror, but to not look away, to not try to deny certain facts. And one of those facts is that October 7th is really bad. And I think it's simply, do not by any means wish to make any excuses for the Israelis, because I think it's quite right. The Israelis, the Zionists, are really using this as an excuse to engage in ethnic cleansing and a massive, brutal military assault, which is, I think the death count now is up to 32,000, and I'm sure it'll go many times higher before this war is finished. But we've got to understand the war in all its complexity, and we've got to understand, we've got to diagnose it in order to come up with a cure. And that means taking all the facts into account in as clear and objective a fashion as we can. I just would point out that Lenin and Trotsky, and Lenin wrote about this repeatedly. Lenin was a great pioneer on the national question. In contrast to people like Rosa Luxemburg, he emphasized time and again that the national question was central. It could not be skirted. Marxists must fight for the for liberation and equality of all oppressed nations. All oppressed nations had the same, all nations, period, had the same right to equality, independence, free development, etc. But Lenin stressed time and again. I'm thinking of an article he wrote in 1915 and his famous notes on the national question, which were published in 1920, I believe. He stressed that national development could only take place in an international socialist community. In other words, nations could not develop in an egotistical fashion. They could only develop like an individual. An individual can only develop as part of a democratic socialist community, and an individual nation is the same thing, really. And Lenin talked about national independence for the colonial world as a means of achieving international proletarian unity on a higher level. It was important to emphasize national equality as in this context, and surely slaughtering hundreds of your fellow workers is not the way to achieve proletarian unity. So I think that and Lenin's thesis that the international proletariat was the only force capable of being of achieving national liberation. I think this has been horribly, catastrophically, but quite spectacularly illustrated by Gaza. I mean, what we're seeing is that yes, Hamas succeeded in swatting the tiger on the nose, but then what happened is that once the tiger recovered its senses, in a matter of hours, there was hell to pay. And what we've seen now has been the ongoing military defeat of the Palestinian people. This is being called a Nakba 2, Nakba 1, of course, being the mass expulsions of 1947 to 49. But I think Nakba 2 is actually incorrect, because I think what we're seeing is Nakba squared. Simply the greatest defeat suffered by the Palestinian people in the history of the modern Palestinian movement, and Hamas's disastrous role in this has got to be faced squarely. So that's it.
Thank you. I don't think the documentary was very soft on Hamas, I have to say. I mean, they're linked, Qatar, etc. But it is, I thought they were, at the end, particularly, you see the guy from the political bureau, after we've seen scenes of Gazans starving and, being slaughtered, etc. He says, well, that's the sacrifice they're willing to make, and it doesn't really look like the Palestinians were wanting to make that kind of sacrifice. So I think there is criticism of Hamas in that program as well. So I thought it was quite objective, or as objective as it could be. So thanks, Dan. Paul, please.
Just carry on from this discussion that Dan started here on what Tony said. I thought when this attack first took place, I thought, well, they've been allowed to do this. And then I started thinking a bit more about it. And then I thought, well, nothing would surprise me with Netanyahu and his friends. I mean, they're completely amoral. They're completely cynical. But to have carried out a stunt like that would have involved an awful lot of other people in the military and intelligence sectors in Israel. And that was the area where a lot of the opposition to Netanyahu was coming from in those big demonstrations. So that made me think, well, no, this is not a false flag job, but it's just still quite unbelievable that it was allowed to happen, that they let it happen by gazing elsewhere. It does seem amazing, but that seems to be the case. They weren't looking. But coming back to what I think Tony was saying, now I think that Hamas must have known that an Israeli government, and especially one of the far right, would respond not just strongly but catastrophically. We've all known from comrades like Tony, from Moishe Machover and other people, that the Israeli right, the Zionist right, has always wanted to finish off the Nakba, get rid of the Palestinians altogether from what they see as Greater Israel. In fact, I was just reading a book the other day, and it mentions that Menachem Begin came out with this in 1948. He said, "This is just the foundation. Soon we're going to have the Israel from the river to sea, etc., etc." So that's always been on their agenda, and of course, Hamas has given them the excuse to do this, the Hamas attack. So why did Hamas do it? Now, I think that what they was aiming at was to provoke a response, probably not as much as has happened, but they wanted a big response from Israel, and that would, I think, they hoped, would lead to a conflagration right across the Middle East, as all the states that are hostile to Israel would pile in. But as we know, the Iranian regime wants a level of instability within the Middle East. It certainly doesn't want a war, because it would come out of it very badly. Hezbollah's done its own fight with Israel, which doesn't correspond with Hamas and the Palestinian thing in general. We do have historical precedents in wanting to a nationalist organisation wanting to provoke a major conflagration and then try and get something out of the wreckage. If we look at the Ukrainian nationalists of the 1930s, the organisation of Ukrainian nationalists, they were banking on the Second World War, the Germany versus the Soviet Union, and hopefully get a Ukrainian state out of that conflagration. Well, they did for about 3 weeks until the Nazis stamped on it. After the war, Stepan Bandera, the main leader of the OUN, was hoping for a USA versus Soviet Union war, because he hoped that a Ukrainian state would come out of the wreckage there. A very rather radioactive one, but nevertheless, that's what he was aiming at. So this kind of catastrophism of provoking a war and then hoping that something will come out of it is not unknown. So I think that's what Hamas's tactics were. But as I thought at the time, as I told friends at the time, I said, this is a massive own goal. And I really think that what Israelis doing now is basically to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza. And after all, someone said, this dock they're building to unload boats from Cyprus could also be used for shifting Palestinians out on ships. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Tony isn't here to respond, but I've had lots of meetings with him since, and Moshe, and they both actually don't think that Hamas believed that the rest of the states, the Arab states, would take action. It was more because they are run by despots who often have dealings now with Israel as well. So, but they both were saying that they believe that Hamas's strategy, if you can call it that, was to stop the normalization of the oppression of Israelis. You had Saudi Arabia and Israel, they're having discussions on a diplomatic level, etc. And it was just a sort of an act of despair, in that we're still here, but I don't think they expected. That's what Moshe and Tony are saying, and they know this kind of stuff better than me. They didn't expect the Arab states to come to their rescue. They just wanted to have it back on the agenda, and they succeeded in that at least. But thank you, Paul. Ian.
Good evening, comrades. I saw the film today, and I thought it was excellent. I mean, I don't think there's anything in the film that tries to glorify Hamas at all. It certainly isn't. I mean, it tries to show it in a documentary style, and in a sense, as Tina's already pointed out, really, Hamas is condemned out of their own mouths, really. But what really struck me was a couple of things. Firstly, that the Israeli Defense Force isn't very good. That despite enormous resources, vast expenditure on weapons, that considering what's spent on them, they're actually not that good. And that's because I suspect that a lot of their time is spent fighting kids throwing stones or bullying people on the West Bank or whatever. The striking thing, I mean, things I was completely unaware of, was that a lot of the destruction to one of the kibbutz that was shown was by weapons that clearly Hamas didn't possess. You know, you can't demolish a whole house with a rocket propelled grenade, and just things like that, really. And it seems to me that the Israeli Defense Force, once they were presented with what to them must have been a catastrophe happening on their watch, simply opened up by destroying everything. And from that point of view, that's a horribly ill-disciplined army. I've been watching recent retired British Army commentators on the actions of the IDF, and even things like rounding up a load of people from the Al-Shifa hospital or wherever else and parading them around in their underpants and putting them in stress positions and the rest of it is the kind of thing a really ill-disciplined army would do. And you can't see the point of it unless it's to appeal to a kind of home audience or whatever. You're certainly absolutely guaranteeing the next generation of fighters against you. What was and of course the other thing was it was the hubris that led them to ignore the intelligence that they knew. They were being told that Hamas were on the way, but they just thought, oh, it can't possibly happen. Even once the maneuvers had started, they sort of acted very slowly, and then all of a sudden, of course, they had to act very, very quickly, and they basically then just shot everything that moved, and that's one of the problems with attack helicopters. You can't discern one friend or other, and obviously the Hannibal Directive has been a real feature, and again, it's a sign of a really poorly run, poorly led army. Why would you do that? It's completely destructive to your own ends. The damage to the kibbutz just simply couldn't have been done by anybody but the IDF. I mean, and probably only by tanks. So you've got a bizarre situation where the IDF had rolled into one of their own kibbutzim and just started blasting away with a tank. I can't see any other possible conclusion. And the commentator was a British military expert analyst who didn't have any kind of axe to grind, particularly as far as I can see. The other thing is, I mean, friendly fire incidents are not at all uncommon, and they often happen in the heat of the moment, and you've got a split second, and you can't tell whether it's an enemy or a friend. But this just seemed to be just shoot everything that moved and hope God sorts them out. It's a film which I think should be absolutely mandatory viewing. As regards all the atrocities, they're very, very easily debunked, and they have been now for some time. And it's now the most significant casualty is any kind of idea that the IDF or Israel has any kind of legitimacy whatsoever. But yes, thank you.
Thanks, Ian. I mean, the film does not deny that there were atrocities by Hamas and by, as Tony says as well, that they are showing that once the gates were open, all sorts of people started pouring into Israel and using the opportunity to loot and to do, well, possibly other things as well. But it is, I thought it was quite an even-handed film, and it is very, very interesting. So do check it out, comrades. Two more comrades want to speak. Can you please be short, because we've got two other issues that we want to discuss tonight. Victor.
Evening, Tina and comrades. It's blaringly obvious that the Zionists are deliberately seeking a war of annihilation. Their pretext, given that the Zionists have actually killed more hostages than they've liberated, their pretext that they're liberating hostages is no more valid than Tony Blair's pretext that he was in Iraq in order to stop us being wiped out in 45 minutes by weapons of mass destruction. War of annihilation, rather like the one the Nazis said they were fighting when they double-crossed Stalin in Russia. We joined the dots, therefore, and see where it is us. We are so
Sorry, Victor, your microphone is breaking up. Victor, we can't really hear you. Your microphone is.
I'm sorry, I can't help the microphone.
Sorry, it's not really. Can't really understand what you're saying.
Well, I could carry on.
Okay. Sorry,
I'll
comrade.
give up then.
Okay, sort it out for next time. Steve, please.
I'll be quick, Tina. I just wanted to make this point. I haven't actually seen these films, but I just want to make this comment. It's a bit like the French Revolution. You remember that somebody said, I don't know, not long ago, that might have even been Lenin 100 years later. French Revolution, too early to say the consequences of that. And I think it's too early to judge the impact of what's happened. I mean, we can count numbers, 33,000 people dead as compared to 1,200 people dead on the other side. You know, the balance there is massively terrible, the destruction, etc. But really what you had here was a rebellion, an armed uprising, really, by a resistance movement against an oppressor state. And I think that we don't know really, because if you just think another example, the Easter uprising that was crushed in 1916, well, what did that lead to? Well, it was complete and utter defeat. People said it was a complete and utter waste of time. And yet within 2 or 3 years, the whole situation had changed and Ireland had gone into a popular revolution that led to the British being driven out. So we cannot say yet how this movement, because it's an international thing, it's not just there. Look at what America's about to do. Look what Israel's doing. So the whole thing is much more complicated, and it's literally too soon to see whether this uprising will ultimately have a progressive impact on the situation or complete and utter disaster in terms of how the whole thing pans out. That's all I want to say, really.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everybody. Check out Tam, the website that Tam mentioned, theculturalintifada.com. I put it in the chat again. It's really inspiring, really important that we don't just go to demonstrations but use our voices in every way we can. This is a very good way to get involved in the resistance. Thank you, Tam. Let us know if anything new comes up or if there are any online webinar events that we can publicize, etc. We'll put that in the bulletin that goes out to everybody. Thank you. We're now taking a look at Dune from a communist perspective, and we've got with us Jackson Mann from the US. I have to admit, I'm not an expert on Dune. I've seen bits of the films, bit of a drag, but nice enough, entertaining science fiction. But I am interested because I saw Jackson has written an article for his magazine Cosmonaut in the US about Dune from a communist perspective. And the bits I saw were all about, you know, a chosen savior, Paul, the Messiah. He's the one. And basically it's up to him to liberate everybody, which is kind of the opposite of what communism is about. So Jackson, what can we actually as communists learn and take away from Dune?
I had a whole presentation, but I think I'm just going to emphasize because
sorry.
No, you're good, because you're like you're like putting me in the middle of what my presentation would be. So I think it might make sense to just talk a little bit about it kind of on the fly, as opposed to giving you all the sort of background of the created world and all that nonsense. So yeah, I mean, Dune, I'm sure that many people who are listening have read this book. It's a classic sort of speculative fiction book, science fiction from 1965. It was written by Frank Herbert, who until that point was relatively unknown. He was kind of he was a journalist, mostly for local news outlets, different parts of the West Coast, mostly lived on the West Coast for most of his life of the United States. But yeah, it was his breakout hit. It led to a sort of 6-book series that was incredibly famous. His son then went on to write like something like 50 more of these books. So there's a lot of them. So my analysis of Dune really kind of brackets the first novel. It doesn't really make sense if you continue to read the rest of the books, what I have to say about the first book. As Tina was saying, like the book is quite reactionary on its face. It's an unbelievably reactionary work. It's very, very homophobic. It's incredibly misogynistic. The sort of level of Orientalism that is present in the book, I would describe as tiresome. It is incredibly difficult to read because of how Orientalist, in an almost like comical way, the book is. And then I think even underneath all of those sort of like aspects of it that are just reactionary on their face, the book really is a book for the ruling class. It's a book about educating people how to rule. And so it has a lot in common with opera seria. So for those who might not know, opera seria is basically a catch-all sort of periodization term that's used in historical musicology to refer to opera, sort of pre-French Revolutionary opera. So before the French Revolution, most operatic productions were kind of oriented around much more of a sort of court-based sort of circuit of theaters. And so obviously the thematic sort of quality of these operas was very much oriented towards the ruling class, the people who would be in these theaters. And many of the themes were about sort of like good governance, teaching sort of young nobles, like very didactic, sort of elite didacticism, teaching young nobles how to rule effectively. And on the surface, the first Dune novel that's basically what it's about. It's about teaching sort of young nobility how to rule. It does this in a number of ways. One of the sort of primary scenes that I often refer to with regard to this aspect of the novel is in the center of the book. There's sort of 2 back-to-back scenes in which the primary protagonist, Paul, who's this sort of hero figure that Tina mentioned, is kind of like contrasted with the character that the narrative is slowly setting up to be his rival. And this is that character's name is Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, who's from like an opposing noble house. So in these 2 back-to-back scenes, both of the characters are put into situations where they need to sort of fight another person to prove their sort of ability to rule. And in both cases, they kill their opponent. But in the first scene featuring Paul, his sort of emotional reaction to the killing of his opponent is one of like deep regret. He like very openly like sort of weeps about the death of this person. Even during the fight, he's very resistant. He asks the person to yield. And he only kills his combatant after he's told that he has to, because in the sort of desert culture that he's found himself in, and if you've read the book, there's a lot of background to this, but in the desert culture that he's found himself in because he escaped from the Harkonnens killing his family or whatever, it's like basically culturally he's expected to kill a combatant who's failed, so he has to. But again, he does it with all this sort of restraint, and he ends up sort of receiving the respect of the other members of this group of people, the Fremen, who are these sort of indigenous people of the planet that he's on, because he's shown so much restraint about having to kill one of his subjects, quote unquote. In the second scene that features the rival character, Feyd-Rautha, Feyd-Rautha is just like totally excessive, extremely. He's unbelievably violent to his subjects. He just kills them on a whim in incredibly horrific ways. He uses their deaths in these very like devious ways to make himself look better. And so these 2 scenes back to back, where we're shown sort of the heroic sort of protagonist and the main villain sort of in the same sort of circumstances, but reacting in very, very different ways to those circumstances. It's sort of probably the most explicit instance of how Dune is supposed to be teaching young nobles like the appropriate sort of way that they should be interacting with their subjects. But there's a number of scenes throughout the book that do this. That's just sort of the central one. It also focuses a lot on the development of sort of ruling class consciousness. So there's many, many scenes throughout Dune in which sort of different characters who are of the ruling class or of the sort of administrative classes that run this sort of, intergalactic civilization that exists in this sci-fi world. There are many scenes in which these different characters sort of come to mutually recognize one another as rulers, as like fellow members of the ruling class. And there is one scene in particular that is very intense with regard to this, where one of the main villains of the book, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, he has captured his sort of nemesis, who's one of the protagonists, the father of the main protagonist, Duke Leto. He's captured Duke Leto, and he means to execute him. But there's a brief moment in which you see the sort of inner thoughts of the Baron, where he doesn't want to do it. I think the exact quote is, he was, quote, reluctant to subject another noble person to so much pain, end quote. I think that's almost the exact quote. And so that scene is this very intense moment in which it's revealed to us that actually even the sort of one of the villainous characters of this story is reluctant to kill his rival as a result of his subjectivity as a part of the ruling class. And so the novel is very much a book for the ruling class on its face. But there are certain sort of aspects of the way in which the book sort of frames the sociality of the ruling class that I do think are very interesting for socialists. These are mostly the result of this sort of social nihilism of the author. So Frank Herbert was very, very nihilistic. He had a very, very poor view of humanity. He tended to see ruling classes in a very negative light, even if he also did not see sort of subaltern subjects as any better. So he was very, very socially nihilistic. But because of that, the sort of ruling class of Dune's world ends up being sort of not necessarily positive, even though they are the protagonists of the book. So the way in which I think that this is registered throughout the book, and some of you may know this, but in Dune, all of the sort of ruling class characters, the sort of imperial administrators of this big space galactic empire, they all have superpowers. They all have these sort of superhuman powers, many of which are said to be the result of something called spice melange. So this is this sort of psychoactive drug that comes from the planet that most of the story takes place on, that all these sort of characters in the created world believe give you elongated life and like these kind of superhuman powers and psychic abilities and prescience and all this stuff. So all the sort of ruling class characters, we're told as a reader, have these sort of superhuman abilities as a result of the spice. There's some eugenic arguments for why they have them, all different sorts of arguments for why they have them. Now, one of the main super sort of human abilities that many of the characters in the book have is this thing called the voice. So this is the ability to basically psychically bend the will of others using your voice alone. The main organization in the sort of created world that makes use of this power is the Bene Gesserit. So this is like a sororal sort of order of noble women who train themselves to be able to do this, to sort of bend the will of others. And so, yeah, we're told that these powers exist over and over. And in the films, all the screen adaptations, and in the later books, this is why I was saying earlier that this really only works if you're talking about the first book. These powers are pretty much unambiguous. Like, all the characters really do have superpowers. They all have these superhuman powers, and it's real. But if you just read the first book, you'll notice that in the first novel, it's not actually clear that these powers exist. It's not clear that they're real. almost all of the sort of explicit representations of the uses of these powers are very ambiguous what's actually happening. So the one scene that I often point out with regard to this that I think is a very good example is a very, very famous scene in which Paul, the main character, and his mother, Jessica, both of whom have survived the attack on their planet that like starts much of the story, both try to use this power to escape some soldiers who have taken control of them. So in the movies, this is always represented as just like a totally unambiguous use of like a psychic power or like a superpower. But in the books, it's like not clear that that's what actually happens. So in the movies, every time I've seen now there's 3 screen adaptations of this that I've seen, this scene, and every single one, basically Jessica, the mother of the protagonist, uses this power, the voice, to order one of the soldiers that has captured them to kill another soldier. And she uses the power, and the soldier does it, and they kill each other, and they escape. In the book, what actually happens is very, very strange. So they capture the 2 soldiers, they capture Paul and Jessica, and they bring them onto this like ship that they're gonna take them out into the desert and leave them there to die. So as they're traveling on the ship, they gag Jessica because both the soldiers know that Jessica has this power, or they're aware that she has this power, or has claimed to have this power. But they don't gag Paul, the sort of protagonist. So they're traveling out into the desert, and the 2 soldiers start talking about that they want to rape Jessica before they leave these 2 characters in the desert. This sort of shocks Paul. He begins to like he begins to sort of get really nervous, and he tries to use the voice on the soldiers to get them to undo Jessica's gag so that she can use her even more developed powers to get them to kill each other. Now, Jessica in the book says, she's talking to herself, she says, oh, that was a perfect use of the voice. But the soldiers don't listen to him. The soldiers actually don't react to his use of the voice, which is very strange, right? If this power was real and he used it perfectly, why would they not react? They actually have like a short conversation about what they should do, whether they should undo her gag before they rape her. And so they decide to do it. So they do go undo her gag, but it's not because Paul told them to or used this power to force them to do it. They do it kind of their own accord. And then all of the films have Jessica order one soldier to kill the other soldier. That's not what happens in the book. In fact, what happens is that Jessica, once her gag, she doesn't have a gag anymore, she says, I think it's something like, quote, "There's no need to fight over me." That's what she says. And that suddenly changes the attitude of the 2 soldiers because they're sort of like hyped up because they've just been in this battle. They're kind of like really, really intense and emotional. They suddenly think that they're going to have to fight over Jessica, and they end up fighting over who gets to rape her first, which leads them to attack each other and kill each other kind of accidentally. And so this isn't Jessica using a like superhuman power to get them to kill each other. She's actually just using the power of suggestion. So it's really, and this is just like a particular scene, but this is almost every demonstration of these powers is very ambiguous like this. It's like, it's not clear that these powers are actually happening.
Can I ask you something, Jackson? Because it's on your Cosmonaut article, you describe that a lot of the left in America were trying to put a socialist spin on the film, or almost like, see that say there's something that it's it shows revolution, it shows all sorts of positive things for the working class, etc. And I really struggled with that. Why do you think they try to do that?
No, I mean, I think my article was a reaction to many articles that were circulating as you said, circulating in the US left that were like, oh, this is a great book because it's like a book about the working class or something, or it's about ecology. And I mean, that's just not true. I mean, this book is very reactionary. And what I was interested in doing was like, well, people are interested enough in this book to really want to make it something that it doesn't seem to be on the surface. So maybe there is something there. And so I started thinking about this book. And when I ended up kind of, as I was sort of rereading it a number of times, I was like, oh, there is something interesting in this book, but it's not like the sort of stuff that they're saying. It's the way in which the book sort of like shows how the ruling class develops its own ideology of itself. Like that there's a lot in the book because it's because Frank Herbert as an author was kind of socially nihilistic. Even though the book is about the ruling class, it's not necessarily positive about them. And it ends up sort of actually containing a number of interesting scenes where you witness how the ruling class develops a sort of ideology of its own social role and what it is. And a lot of these powers, I think, are, especially in the first book, are good instances of this, where how do we understand the way the ruling class thinks about itself? How do we understand the way the ruling class develops an ideology of its own social role and like why it's in that social role? And there are a number of scenes that do this very well, where because of their ambiguity about the reality of these superpowers that all these ruling class people have, you can kind of like begin to sort of extract a kind of a theory of the sort of sociality of the ruling class and how they develop their own sort of like ideology. I don't know if that makes any sense.
What was also interesting, I mean, it does touch on the film version anyway, things of like climate change and, you know, that desert planet. There were plans to make it into a green planet and make it properly habitable, and then it wasn't profitable. So there are references to, you know, the profit motive. I think one of the really bad guys, he couldn't float. I don't know his name. He floats in the air, but he goes like, you know, it's about the profit and just extract or something, you know, along those lines. So they're trying to get spice out of that planet, and they basically left it in ruins because it's all about the profit margin. So there's a bit of something there for Marxists, perhaps.
I mean, I think what I say in my original article is that I don't feel that stuff is interesting enough to make it worthwhile for communists, because there just is like, there's a long history of this kind of stuff in speculative fiction. Like there's like, why Dune? Why Dune? There's like so much speculative fiction that deals with these same problems of ecology, that deals with the political economy in more interesting ways. Why this book that's actually quite reactionary? And for me, that the answer to that question was, well, why? Well, it has this one aspect that actually is interesting about like how the ruling class understands itself. Because for me, yeah, just the questions of ecology and political economy in Dune are just not that interesting, especially considering the fact that there's all these setbacks for it.
It does feel a bit tacked on, but you know, I mean, it is a, as you said, it's been read millions of times, and you do come across quite a lot of lefties who seem to love it, and I always struggled with understanding that. Thank you very much, Jackson. It was a very interesting discussion. We want to look at George Orwell next, and we've got another American comrade with us, Dan Lazar. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. George Orwell is a ambiguous figure, perhaps of the left, sort of, but used by the right to attack much of the left. So it'd be interesting to have your take on him.
Yeah. By the way, I imagine that everyone taking part in this webinar has read Orwell. Am I correct? Is there anyone here who has not read Orwell, who has not read Animal Farm or 1984? That the fact that I imagine there isn't, that just says a great deal about Orwell. I mean, he was an immensely popular writer, and he was his fiction was extraordinarily vivid and well plotted. I mean, like so many people, I read Animal Farm around age 12 or 13, and I read 1984 around the same time, and of course I had no idea what they were about. I thought Animal Farm was a great animal story, and 1984 is a wonderful dystopic novel. Then of course, a few years later, like everyone, I slapped my forehead and said, "Oh my God, is that what it was really about? Is it really about the Russian Revolution?" And in Big Brother and Emmanuel Goldstein in 1984, oh my God, that was really about Stalin and Trotsky. So it's an incredible tribute to Orwell that his fiction works simultaneously on two levels, as political satire and as a plain old adventure story. And I think that's really a tribute to his remarkable abilities. And I can't think of anyone else who is nearly as good as that in that respect. But when you try to ask why did Orwell, what made him so good, I think that what it comes down to is he was kind of a poet of everyday life. He had a way of sort of settling in on the odd detail and seizing on it, and in a way that was very vivid and very convincing. And he also was very comfortable with the contradictions of everyday life. I'm thinking that there were Orwell sometimes accused of harboring certain anti-Semitic tendencies. I never really saw that actually, but one of the remarkable opening scenes in 1984 is when he's in a movie theater and they're showing a news item about the bombing of a refugee lifeboat, and the film shows what Orwell describes as a fat Jewess trying to protect a small boy from a bomb about to blow the boat to smithereens. And fat Jewess is not the nicest phrase, I guess we can say. Many people today would shrink from that phrase. But it quite illustrates quite well illustrates the hero, Winston Smith. His mingled horror, repulsion, hatred, sympathy for what he's seeing on the screen. And I think that really is psychologically quite vivid because it's quite realistic, and it shows all the mingled emotions that we all feel in our everyday lives. At the end of the newsreel, they stop the newsreel because some proletarian woman starts complaining loudly that they ought to show this in front of children. And Winston Smith gets very angry and says, stupid prole, why don't they shut them up? Why don't they get rid of them? And it's, of course, a very bad thing to say, but it's a very realistic thing to say because we know ourselves that we're often subject to these kinds of, mixed tendencies. We're often confused. We often don't quite understand what's happening. We often react the wrong way. And so I thought this is really quite realistic. And he had an ability to zero in on these odd details and to discuss them in a really frank way that was quite vivid. He was also a very witty writer. He went almost out of his way to be honest, almost to a fault. And he often delighted in saying things that were kind of politically incorrect. For example, in March 1940, he reviewed a new edition of Hitler's Mein Kampf. And he began it by saying that I should like to put on record that I have never been able to dislike Hitler. Ever since he came to power, I have reflected that I would certainly kill him if I could get within reach of him, but I could feel no personal animosity. In fact, there is something deeply appealing about him. And that was a very odd, strange, but certainly riveting thing to say. He opened up another book review by telling a story. It says, reading a certain book, I thought of a rather cruel trick I once played on a wasp. He was sucking jam on my plate, and I cut him in half. He paid no attention, merely went on with his meal while a tiny stream of jam trickled out of his severed esophagus. Only when he tried to fly away did he grasp the dreadful thing that had happened to him. So again, very vivid, almost kind of sadistic, but certainly an image that will stay with you for a long time. He opened a famous essay in February 1941 during the Blitz, in which he said, "As I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead trying to kill me." He went on in the same essay to write that England resembles a family, a rather stuffy Victorian family with not too many black sheep in it, but with all the cupboards bursting with skeletons. It has rich relations who have to be kowtowed to, and poor relations who are horribly sat upon, and there's a deep conspiracy of silence about the source of the family income. A family with all the wrong members in control. That perhaps is as near as one can get to describing England in a phrase. I thought that's also very good, very homely, but very good, very vivid. I think very well done. Orwell became famous because he fought in the Spanish Civil War. He fought on the side of the PUM. That was the Partido Obrera Unita Marxista, if I have the Spanish correct. And that was a semi-Trotskyist party, and that in Spain, Orwell found himself, as a consequence, on the run, both from the fascists and from the Stalinists. And that kind of, in a sense, he never left Barcelona, because the rest of his life, he was always sort of like, obsessed with this battle between Stalinism and fascism, between Trotsky and Stalin himself. Orwell was never an orthodox Trotskyist by any means. He was kind of a left social democrat who did approach Trotskyism on certain occasions, but never actually embraced Trotskyist ideology. After the war, he became a dedicated laborite. He threw in his lot with the Attlee government, supported it down the line, and really had no basic criticisms of it. So therefore, he certainly left the Marxist fold at that point. But anyway, I just wanted to. So I've discussed all the reasons to like Orwell. Very honest, a left socialist. He really felt passionately about socialism. He was quite sincere in his embrace of the proletarian cause. We might object to the ideological conclusions that he drew on all occasions, but he certainly staked out some very brave positions for himself, and was absolutely fearless in taking on friend and foe, absolutely unafraid to attack the complacent orthodoxies of the day, and in Spain certainly, and back home in England afterwards. So I just want to talk about a little bit. So those are sort of the reasons to like Orwell. Now, how about the reasons to dislike Orwell? And what became increasingly common from the 1980s on is that Orwell had emerged as kind of a neocon hero. All his anti-communist, communist with a capital C, statements were sort of isolated and sort of added to the neocon arsenal. Certain neocon journals here in the U.S., like the New Republic, it seemed like every week there'd be a new issue would open up with some kind of reverential quotation from Orwell. Orwell was the great moral authority, and therefore he sort of was really embraced by the neocons, and for a lot of radicals that became the enemy of my if the enemy of my enemy is my friend, then the friend of my enemy must be my enemy as well. So a lot of radicals sort of took umbrage at Orwell. Here in the U.S., a guy named Alexander Coburn, now deceased, a very witty columnist for the Village Voice and the Nation, who was very influential on the left. He sort of took after Orwell and was, I think, had a significant role in turning many people against him. But then, of course, what happened in 2003 is that The Guardian published a document that Orwell wrote shortly before his death in 1950. He had been invited to write for how is it called? The Information Research Division, which was a secret propaganda unit that had been organized by the Attlee government. And in so doing, he compiled a list of 38 names of people who should not write for the IRD. And they included Paul Robeson and a number of others. And the names were accompanied by shorthand characterizations that many people found offensive. I mean, the most unfair one is referred to Paul Robeson as anti-white, and that is completely wrong. So with the publication of that document, I think it's fair to say that Orwell's reputation took a nosedive. I felt very sad about it myself because I said I'm a great admirer of Orwell. I think he was really a great writer. And I think he was a great leftist, despite all his shortcomings, his failures, his mistakes. Because I thought he really played a heroic role, in really crucial moments. And I think that Homage to Catalonia, Animal Farm, 1984, these are really literary and political treasures, which we should not throw overboard. They're part of they're part of the left-wing arsenal that we should not toss aside. But of course, especially in America, that list, which came out, which Orwell penned in, I think, 1949, that summoned up memories of McCarthyism. And McCarthyism, as I'm sure everyone here knows, was an episode in which communist fellow travelers, leftists generally, were purged from government, from academia, from the arts, from Hollywood, etc. It was a very scary, frightening time, and it sort of led to a political ice age settling in that lasted for a full decade. So, as I said, Orwell's reputation took a nosedive. I would point out in Orwell's semi-defense that he was not calling for these people to be punished or purged or in any way, forced out of their jobs, which is the kind of thing we saw in America. He just merely said they should not be asked to write for the IRD. And to me, it's always the real question as the IRD as a branch of British intelligence. I mean, to me, the real sin is that Orwell was writing for British intelligence and that he saw nothing wrong with this. And this is at a time when British intelligence, of course, was operating hand in glove with U.S. intelligence, and when the Cold War was just getting off the ground, just being organized, just taking its first steps. So to me, the naming names in this way was, although it has horrible associations, it's somewhat less important than the mere fact that Orwell was collaborating in this intelligence effort, and that I think should be borne in mind. But again, just to reiterate, I just don't want to see the baby thrown out with the bathwater. That I think that Orwell was a great writer from whom we can read with great profit. His essays were extraordinary. They make really great writing. For anybody who's a writer, reading Orwell is just incredibly educational because it's really marvelous to see what a really a first-class prose stylist can do. And all of us who labor trying to put words on paper or on the screen these days, we all can learn a great deal from his mastery of the art. Anyway, that's it.
Really interesting. Thanks, Dan. That sort of begs the question, isn't it? Can bad people make good art? You know, I mean, it is a wider discussion. What do you think about that subject? Should we look at art and produce it separately?
I think the world would be a lot better place if only good people made good art, but it would be less interesting. I think that anybody who enjoys Wagner, as I do. Wagner was one of the great shits of modern music, but he was also an incredible genius. He wrote some of the most amazing music we've ever, that's ever been composed in the last 2 centuries. And so I think that the paradox is there, and I think that that Orwell, we should take him warts and all. I wish he was perfect, but he was not perfect. But nonetheless, his stuff is really valuable, really worth treasuring, really worth reading again and again.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. There's quite a few people with their hands up. I also hope that Comrade Tamlin Byrne will come back in because I think he was going to say something more earlier and I didn't ask him and I sort of cut him off. Apologies. So Tam, if you want to come in, please switch on your camera and I'll bring you back in. Ian first.
Yeah, I agree with you about Orwell, but I feel strongly that you don't really have to like the artist to like the art. Nikolai Gogol was an appalling anti-Semite, a dreadful person in so many ways, but he wrote fantastic revolutionary novels, revolutionary with a small r, as it were, really quite remarkable. But my introduction to Orwell was on holiday in Spain, and for my sort of beach reading on the beach, I took with me the longer non-fiction of George Orwell. So I read Road to Wigan Pier and Homage to Catalonia and Down and Out in Paris and London. Of course, Down and Out in Paris and London was written first, and I read them Homage to Catalonia last, and it's amazing, and it's also a good story about how, in a way, revolutions make revolutionaries. Because if you read Down and Out in Paris and London and Road to Wigan Pier, Orwell was in the Independent Labour Party and therefore had this sort of reformist approach, as you might expect from an old Etonian who sort of been rubbing shoulders with the working classes. But by the time he got to Barcelona, it was remarkable. Almost one of the first things he says, well, fairly early on in the book, he says, all of a sudden you realised you were in a city where the working class was in control. Waiters looked you in the eye and refused tips on a point of principle, and just things like that. And what comes across from Homage to Catalonia is his revulsion at Stalinism. He says fairly early on, the thing to understand about the Spanish Communist Party in that context was that they were on the right, not the left. And later on in Homage to Catalonia, he talks about how he's glad he spent his time with anarchists and Trotskyists and not with the Communist Party. Because at one point he did try to join the International Brigade, but because he was in the only reason why he was in the POUM was because he was in the ILP and there were fraternal relations between them. That he subsequently helped compile blacklists or informed. He was informing really against people he regarded as Stalinists. And I think in 1984, the fact that he's talking about INGSOC, English socialism, sort of a grim premonition of what. And of course, he wasn't the first one of what an authoritarian society claiming to be socialist would be like in an English context, and he was horrified at that possibility. But again, you don't have to like the artist to like his art, I think. And I just recommend it to anyone. All of Orwell's work is superb, and take each essay or whatever else on its own merits. I think it was magnificent. Thank you for your contribution, Dan.
Thanks, Ian. Tam, do you want to come in now?
Well, okay. Or if anybody's got any more to say on Orwell, go for that, and I'll pop back shortly.
Okay, yeah, we'll have some other people first. I thought you wanted to speak on Orwell as well. Sorry, misunderstood. Okay, Paul, please, Paul Flewis.
Yeah, a couple of things on Orwell here. Supporter of Attlee's government. Well, actually, he was a critical supporter. He was, if you read some of his article in Commentary magazine that from about 48, he was criticising the Attlee government for being too timid on its policies and not doing enough of left-wing policies. He was always critical of the Labour government in that sense. Unfortunately, he did go along with the Cold War side of it. But if you actually look at his writings on the Soviet Union, his review of James Burnham's book, he didn't discount a liberalisation in the Soviet Union. He said that a slave society is not an efficient way to run a society, therefore seeing some sort of possibilities for internal reform, which of course is what happened a few years after his death, after the death of Stalin. So his journalism wasn't as pessimistic as 1984. Now, the problem I think, with Aminal Farm and 1984 is that, as Winston Smith said, I know how, but I don't know why. And that's the thing with Orwell. He could see what was going on. And people in the Eastern Bloc who read 1984 said, blimey, he can really describe this place, and he's never been here. And that was quite something to do. Aminal Farm, why did the pigs become a ruling elite? Well, there's no explanation for it. They just do. Perhaps it's in the nature of pigs to become but this idea of, rather charming idea of putting different sorts of animals as social groups, it's defective, because after all, a pig can't become a dog or vice versa. A cat can't become a cow. There's no idea of how one group of in society, the Bolshevik leadership, became a ruling elite. So that's a bit of a problem. 1984, how did this weird society appear? I mean, how did the world become 3 Stalinist blocks? I mean, this is rather important because, you've got to explain how you get there. Again, he had no idea of it. And he could describe things very well, but actually explaining it, he couldn't. And that's why he's very useful for the right. In fact, this has happened right the way back, and he had to apologise to Dwight MacDonald for Aminal Farm, saying, why is this people can get the wrong conclusion, and Orwell had to apologise. Same thing with 1984. He had to write to people saying, no, I'm not against socialism. I'm against perversion of socialism. To get it wrong once is a misfortune. To do it twice looks like carelessness, as Oscar Wilde's character once said. But for him to become a neocon hero is dishonest, because if you read Aminal Farm, it's clear that Orwell's sympathy is with the revolt, with the revolution. He never saw the October Revolution as a bad thing. Yes, he always felt that there was always something a bit iffy about the Bolsheviks and so forth. But he never opposed the October Revolution, which puts him apart not only from the neocons, but from the Social Democrats as well. So really, that championing of him on the right is dishonest, but you can see through the weakness in Orwell's writings how this has come about. I put a link on the side to an article by Isaac Deutscher, in which he described Orwell as a simple-minded anarchist. And he wasn't being rude, but he was basically saying that the trouble with Orwell is he looks for easy answers. You know, the whole question of dialectics, the whole question of real investigation into things repelled him. And he knew Orwell. He met him on the press bench during the war. And I think that explains it. Really, Orwell was at heart an anarchist, and he couldn't understand the question of for power, how social groups become, from leading a revolution, could become a ruling elite in quite a short period of time, and so forth. So that's the problem with Orwell. He, as I said before, he understood how something happens, but he couldn't understand why.
Thanks, Paul. Two more comrades, and please try to keep it shortish. Thank you. Matthew.
Yeah, I think what comrades have said is right. I mean, I think, you know, you have to understand in terms of, you have to separate the art from the artist. You know, there's no other way. I mean, there are so many artists you can say were complete shits, you know, as people. They were just, in some cases, quite horrible. And, you know, the sort of people you would have locked up. But the question really is, does their art show us any insight on the human condition, on the nature of the society and the world? And I'm sure, you know, the question has to be posed to the art. You know, does you know, anybody can bring, you know, no matter what their social base, they can bring this, you know, bring insight on the human condition to art, and therefore has to be regarded as a thing itself. I think, I mean, obviously, in terms of Orwell, I mean, the key for Orwell is the experience in Spain. I mean, you know, Orwell's member of the ILP, which of course is a left split. At this point, of course, is a left split Labour Party, well to the left of anything we see at the moment. Of course, you know, in the 30s, splits the Labour Party in 1931, and of course, he's part of this thing. You know, what was called the 2.5 International, in between the second and third International, which included, of course, the POUM. I mean, the POUM actually, part of the POUM, of course, split from the Trotskyists. That was the point. I mean, this was the point of the argument between Serge and Trotsky, for instance. You know, Serge supported the POUM, and Trotsky said, no, you know, you can't support these people. They're in favour of the Popular Front, which they were. They became part of the Popular Front. You know, and this is how they were crucified, of course, because they had no alternative to the Popular Front, and that method, actually, which led back to the re-establishment of capitalism, you know, the reconsolidation of capitalism and the betrayal of the revolution. And the thing for Orwell, of course, is the experience in Spain, particularly of the point after May 37, with the attack on the POUM by the Stalinists. You know, precisely, actually including the international brigades. You know, the actual headquarters of the international brigades was used as a torture chamber for the anarchists and members of POUM and the Trotskyists and so on, those to the left of the Stalinists. The Stalinists established a system of their own private jails, in which they obviously imprisoned, you know, all of those forces, and treated them horribly. People were tortured, etc., and killed. And you know, Orwell's own comrades were killed. People he knew were killed in these places. So it's that experience, obviously, which forms his perfectly reasonable hatred of Stalinism. But of course, then as you know, as comrades also said, it's then what theoretical basis does he have to understand Stalinism, or indeed, you know, the nature of theory within the left of Britain, which has always been fairly low level in international terms. You know, so you can see where all this comes from, but it doesn't actually alter the fact that he is a brilliant writer and should be regarded as such. You know, and the book should be read as such. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, William, please.
Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to go against anything nice that was ever said about Orwell. I have read everything he wrote, well, except his newspaper articles, but I read anything he wrote in book form in sequence. He began his book form with My Burmese Days, or Burmese Days, where he had an absolute disillusionment with the British Empire when he was a policeman, and he was a trained policeman in Burma, and he exposed the corruption that went on in the British Empire, warts and all. So he lost favour with the British Empire there. Then I read all his books that in sequence, like Coming Up for Air, Clergyman's Daughter. Now, the book that you are putting a lot of emphasis on is Homage to Catalonia. Now, quite frankly, I knew a lot of the brigadistas that were in Spain, both Irish and British, and they have nothing but hatred and contempt for Orwell for writing that, what they consider a disgusting and lies about what happened in Spain. Now, if you read what he said, he was never in the International Brigade, and if he applied to join, I don't think he would have got in. But I never heard of any evidence that he applied to join. What he did do, and he says it in Homage to Catalonia, he wanted to fire a few shots. So now, first of all, he wasn't in Spain. He was in Spain as a journalist, and he brought his own wife there. Now, you hardly bring your wife to war with you, do you? Well, even an Etonite public school boy wouldn't do a thing like that, or maybe he would, I don't know. But anyway, he got wounded, and he got wounded in the neck, which is a very debilitating way, because it interferes with, you're one of the walking wounded for the rest of your life. You can't talk properly, you can't eat properly, you can't walk properly. So then he left Spain in total disillusionment. Where did he go? He went to an island in the Inner Hebrides in Scotland, where he sat down and he wrote two absolutely disillusioned books, one called Animal Farm and the next one called 1984. And what else did he do? He drew up a list not of 36 people, of 600 people. He went back to being a policeman for the British state, and he had 60 Irish people on that list who were going to be, if in the event of Russia and the Allies not being able to come to a peaceful agreement after World War II, and it was going to be a war between Russia and the Allies, he was after drawing up the list. And who did he include on the list? A man who actually made absolute shite out of him in the Oxford Dictionary, the Oxford Union debate, Sean O'Casey. Now, you can read Sean O'Casey's, he wrote down for Bartham in his autobiography. I think it's the third book. There's 4 books in O'Casey's autobiography, and I think it's the third book. And quite frankly, I think it's compulsory reading for anyone who calls themselves a Marxist and comes from Britain, because it shows them that they haven't got what it takes to be a Marxist, because they don't understand Ireland. O'Casey made absolute shite out of him and made him look like an idiot. And O'Casey, the only reason we had him on that list was O'Casey at that stage was half blind and infirm, and he was no danger to anyone except his intellect. And that's disgusting. Public school boy couldn't miss an opportunity. Couldn't miss an opportunity for to have a go at poor old Casey. Now, I have a personal gripe against him as well, and that is he picked the name of the chief of police in 1984 as Inspector O'Brien. Well, as an O'Brien, the Klan doesn't like that. Okay.
Thanks, William. I did enjoy that. It's just we're running a bit out of time. People put in the chat, often men and wives and husbands and wives went together to Spain to fight. So it's, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Dan, would you like to respond to a few things?
Sure. The interesting thing to me about Homage to Catalonia and Mr. O'Brien, my apologies to you.
William.
But Orwell, almost Catalonia sort of made Orwell a great writer. This is for those of us who are sympathetic to the Poom Trotskyist point of view. Before then, he was a really sort of mediocre writer. He wrote some interesting stuff, but he really didn't find his métier until Barcelona, and I think that really sort of shows the power of proletarian revolution. That when he saw the city where the workers were in control, he was profoundly moved, but profoundly transformed, and really turned into a very different kind of person. And his writing acquired a new vividness and a new life, and I think that's really extraordinary. By the way, I've read the Isaac Deutscher essay about Orwell. I don't agree. I don't think that Deutscher was really fair, and I admire Deutscher tremendously, but I think in this case he was not really fair, and I think that the criticisms really didn't add up, and also I'd point out, maybe I think it was named Paul who said this, Paul Flewers. Sometimes what makes a writer interesting are his flaws. That sometimes because the writer doesn't get it right, or he's struggling, or he's sort of making mistakes, sometimes that actually makes his work more interesting rather than less. So I think that may be the case with Orwell as well. Anyway, that's it. I know you're running out of time.
Sorry, thank you. And I promised Tam to bring him back in. Apologies, Tam. I thought earlier on you were finished, but you wanted to come back in. So let's get you back in. Thank you very much, Dan. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm working on a piece at the moment. It's about David Bowie's album Diamond Dogs that came out coming up for 50 years ago. That begins with the refrain, "This ain't rock and roll, this is genocide." And he wrote that album with the intention of making a musical of 1984. But Orwell's wife wouldn't let him. She wouldn't give the rights at all. So he included some songs called Big Brother in 1984, but he couldn't do the musical. But I'm putting the whole thing through the prism of Gaza, diamond dogs, the Israeli diamond trade, and dogs, packs of dogs in the streets in Gaza, eating flesh from the rubble. So that's going to be a fun piece. Yeah, I just wanted really to bring up the way that the establishment are recognizing the dangers to them of cultural intifada. It's going on to this absolutely disgraceful extent. In this country, we've seen it. I mean, Germany is supposed to be, the worst for it, but I know a young artist that had an exhibition going on at the University of the Highlands in a week, and because she had an artist from Gaza involved in it, they pulled the plugs on the exhibition less than a week before it was going to open. Chicken Shed Theatre in London, North London, that claims to be so inclusive and is a children's theatre, really. They had a set in 9 plays on that. The show had opened, short plays, and this young playwright, she was performing her own play about her trying to get in touch and communicate with her dad in Palestine. Even although the show had opened 2 nights, they pulled the plugs on her short play in it, and then tried to force the guy who reviewed the play and gave a very favorable review to her piece. They tried to get him to take out any reference to her in his review. And on International Women's Day in Brighton, the Brighton Women's Centre pulled the plugs on a stall that was going to be run by Palestinian women for children and families. And that's just the ones I've heard about. And then the Arts Council of England brought in a new doctrine saying that individuals within funded bodies, their statements could affect the company's funding. They backtracked from that, but the damage had been done. The intention, and it's as well as the state, rules and regulations, the way that they've been talking about and treating. Starmer, one of his pledges that he's sticking to is take back our streets. Who do you think he's talking about? Who are they going to take the streets back from? So this is something that the left should be aware of and be recognizing and doing all they can to fight these attacks on culture, because they're going to get worse for sure. That's a way that we can be helping cultural organizations, while they at the same time have to find their independence, have to find their ways around these problems with public bodies and so on. But also there's the side of things that there's a young theatre director now in Brighton is going to be standing against Peter Kyle, the loathsome Labour MP, quite high up now in Starmer's party, in Hove. So these are the sorts of candidates I think that we can certainly rally around more enthusiastically, maybe than Gorgeous George. But there's big fights on the hand that culture is going to be involved in, I think, in lots of different ways. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say, really. I think so. Apart from Dan exposed himself, as I said in the comments, for him to make a slippage from what we'd been talked about, the Hannibal Directive, and to then put across, oh, that's just friendly fire for a few, that says all you need to know, I think, really. The Hannibal Directive was used by the Israelis on October the 7th, wasn't just friendly fire. So why you wanted to deny that, why you wanted to make that slippage, says a lot about you, Dan, as does your unwillingness to support the Palestinian civil society's boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign. So I'm on Tony's side, that's for sure.
A bit sneaky putting that in just before we're finishing the session. Sorry, Dan.
Well, you kept me till then. I didn't get back in there.
But that's you're right. I mean, I agree with you in terms of the extremism, the question of the extremism rules that are now being put through by the government. Censorship is a huge problem of anybody who says anything about Palestine. That's what the whole anti-Semitism smear campaign of the last 8-9 years against Corbyn, etc., was all about. It was to shut down anybody who stands up for Palestine, be it politically, culturally, on any level, and to allow Israel to carry on doing what it does without any kind of criticism and you being called an anti-Semite. Almost as bad as self-censorship, which unfortunately is very widespread as well on the left and beyond. So we have to, as Marxist communists, have to find the strength and the courage to stand up to this BS and stand with Palestine and stand in solidarity. Apologies, comrades, this was a little bit of a tacked together program. My fault for cutting off Tam earlier on. We'll try to do it. Still a new work in progress, and we can only get better, or we could get worse as well, but we'll try not to. Comrades, if you want to present anything interesting you've seen, any experience you had, any interesting book, any new film that's coming out, documentary, please get in touch. We're looking for comrades to make presentations. info@ymarks.com. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And next week, we'll get back with ABC of Marxism, a second session with Ian Spencer. Good night, comrades.